So I am absolutely delighted today to welcome you after your day of design thinking to a session today on data visualization. Now, yesterday was all about telling a story and, design and thinking about your audience and when you are developing and creating anything. And Gavin Allan, who is a data scientist at Barclays Corporate Banking, is here today to share his approach on data visualization. And that is about telling the story. So Gavin is going to give us some principles, take him through our approach. Gavin has come from a business background, not a data background. Now he's working in data. So that's a really interesting approach for all of you technical people. And he's going to take you through a real visualization using a live data set. So welcome, Gavin, and I'll hand over to Gavin, who will take a little bit of time to get his slides up. So we can talk amongst ourselves. Here we go.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
I presume you can see the slides now, yep? Yep, excellent. Okay, thanks everyone for coming along today. As Marion says, I'm here today to talk a bit about data visualization and data storytelling, and kind of focusing on how we generate business value as well from data storytelling, which is obviously one of the most important parts of it. So welcome to the presentation. I've got my LinkedIn on the front screen. I'm sure the slides will be shared afterwards, so feel free to add me in there if you want to as well. In terms of the outline that we're going to go through today, I'm going to talk a bit about my background just to set the scene. I guess give you an overview of why I'm here talking to you about this. Then talk a bit about what data visualization is, talk about how bias can play a role in data visualization, some principles of good design, the visualization thought process and why it's important to understand that. And then lastly, we're going to go through a live example of telling the story, which is based around COVID vaccines and some kind of natural language kind of insights and analysis I've been doing in that. So as yet unreleased actually, so you'll be the first to see it. So we'll run through that at the end. So firstly, to kick off, talking a bit about my background, as Marion mentioned, I didn't come from a technical background. So I originally came to Strathclyde and I was studying international business. I was always going down the route of entrepreneurship. I had my own business throughout university and school. And then in my third year, I studied a data visualization class, which I found really fascinating. And it was just by chance, really, I opted to take that. And that's what then put me down the route I'm doing now. So I was a data analyst, first of all, a water company business stream. And yeah, I kind of taught myself some SQL coding before the interview, enough to just get myself through the interview, really. And I was there for 2 years, mostly working in SQL and Tableau, which is one of the main data visualization tools that I use. So I was there for 2 years, had a really good time. And then I was interested in moving more into the kind of machine learning route and more down kind of data science. So after that, I moved to Virgin Money, and I kind of taught myself Python there and started self-learning machine learning as well. Work at Virgin Money was really interesting. I was doing a lot of work around modeling customer behaviors to try and drive and target our new products, propositions that were being developed within the bank. So that was a really interesting role there, and the first kind of move into kind of data science. And then more recently, I joined Barclays Corporate Bank where I work in data science and also business intelligence, kind of, I guess, visualizing the outputs of the data science work. I'd also probably add in there are a couple of roles I should probably say going within the team at the moment, which may be of interest. If they are, you'll find them on my LinkedIn, so have a look on there. So that's a bit about my background. We'll now kind of dive into data visualization. So first of all, the most fundamental question is, why do we need data visualization, and why is it important? And the reason it's so important is because it lets us uncover or show off hidden gems inside our data. So first of all, if we're going to generate any business value from the data insights that we're producing, we need to have the decision makers in the business taking action from that insight. So there always needs to be an action there for a business stakeholder to go away and maybe change the way they're doing things, or help them make a decision that then changes business for the better and makes value. But if you want them to take action, then they need to understand, trust, and interact with what we're showing them. And this is where data visualization comes in. Effective data visualization, it helps to build this understanding and trust, which is absolutely critical, because if our decision makers aren't taking action from the insight we're producing, then there's no value there for the business. So it really is very, very key. And when we talk about the role of data visualization, so what are we trying to achieve with data visualization? Well, fundamentally, I see it coming down into two different blocks, if you like. And they were aiming to make data insights, firstly, accessible, but also engaging. So that first part about making data insights accessible, we can achieve that through data visualization by making data visualizations that are easy to interact with, very insightful, putting them somewhere where business stakeholders can easily interact with them and gain insights from. But just because we use the best design and we're showing really interesting insights, it doesn't mean we're entitled to have an engaged audience. I've seen it many times. You may produce fascinating insights that are beautifully visualized, but you may not have engaged business stakeholders. So we do need to work with the business audience to get them to understand what we're showing them and to get them interested in what we're showing them as well. And it's also a two-way path, because I quite often find the quantitative insights that we produce, it tells you a lot about what's happening, but we don't have any of the context that the business stakeholders have as subject matter experts. So they can tell us a lot more about why that's happening. So it's really, it's a two-way path. They help build our understanding of what's going on, and we help them with the quantitative insights. And if you combine those two together, that's how we can drive data-informed decisions, which, as I say, is how we generate value for a business. So this one may be a slightly more controversial statement, which may be on purpose, but data visualization is inherently biased. So our role here is to always minimize this bias. And you may be wondering why I'm calling the subject I'm here to talk about and very passionate about biased. The reason for that is because when we're designing data visualizations, it's up to us to make a decision on what we include within that data visualization. So we need to make a judgment call on what's going to be useful to our end audience that we're generating the data visualization for. So we need to make a decision on what we include and what we exclude. And because we can't show everything, it's going to be overwhelming. So the important part here is always to focus on what's useful instead of what's just interesting. So this diagram on the right, I'm a big fan of. I've put the link to the article in which I took it from, which is a really good read if you're interested in having a look. But fundamentally what it's getting at is that the insights we produce most of the time aren't going to be groundbreaking. They're confirming what we already know to be the case, or maybe confirming a widely held belief within the business. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. It still tells us what we think is to be the case is still happening. Or it might confirm something that everyone has thought to be the case, but has never been proved before. So the insights we're producing, first of all, they must be useful. And to determine if they're useful or not, we need to work with our business stakeholders to understand their needs and what they're trying to achieve. So they need to be useful. If they're interesting, fantastic. So that top right category there, category A, that is the perfect situation in that it's useful to the business, it generates value, and it's also interesting. So people are going to want to understand more about it and to engage with it. Underneath that, we have the useful but less interesting. It's still great because it's generating value for the business, but you might have a harder time getting people interested in it, but it doesn't mean it's not useful. And then over in the right, category C and D, we should never really be touching. But especially category D, that's a really dangerous one. If it's useless, but it's really interesting, it's going to lead people down the wrong path, and they're going to spend a lot of time into something that's not really of any value to them. So we always absolutely avoid D and C as well, but yeah, D is the dangerous one. But I'd recommend having a look at that article if you're interested in reading a bit more about this. Next, I'm going to talk about how data visualizations can be skewed. You see this a lot in in the media, especially. You can see data being skewed to fit a particular viewpoint that they want to portray within the article or that they're writing at the time. And yeah, they often are deliberately manipulated to skew our perception of what they're actually showing us. So I've got a real example here from the Daily Mail. So on the left, this is taken straight from a Daily Mail article on the 28th of August last year. And what we're showing here is we're showing COVID cases per week in England. We'll talk through good design principles at the moment. And this is a good segue into it because it's particularly poor design. The reason for that is when we look at it, obviously it's quite sensationalist. There's a lot of really bright colors going on there. The background graphic makes it harder to actually read the trends you're seeing. And on the surface of it though, although there's some poor colors going on, you can kind of see that cases were declining from the end of May. They hit around about the same peak in July, then they started declining again. Some of you may have noticed, but you have to have quite a keen eye to pick it out, is they've actually skewed the axis here. So if I show you the actual data, which I took from government data source on COVID, you see what is actually happening. And I've highlighted that Daily Mail period on the right there to show the actual trend. And what you see is that cases were actually far lower in July than they were at end of May. And they were actually on the rise into August, not on the decline. And if you look closely at that graphic on the left, you'll see what they've done on the x-axis. It starts in about 14-day intervals through kind of May, through June. And then when we get up to August, you see it goes from July 30th to August the 9th, which is 10-day interval. It then jumps to a 4-day interval to the 13th of August, and then a 7-day interval. So they've just completely skewed the axis to fit the viewpoint they were trying to get across. I was always aware this sort of thing happened, but I was quite shocked about how kind of brazen, I guess, it was on this one. But that's a prime example how data can be skewed. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. This is just one of them, but there's lots of ways it can be manipulated. So as we're talking about poor design and the wrong way to do things, it's a good way to talk about what is the right way of doing it. So I'm going to talk about the core principles of data visualization. So there's 3 core principles that I stick by, and it's data visualization should be trustworthy, it should be accessible, and it should be elegant. And I would say these 3 core principles here, I took from Andy Kirk's book, Data Visualization, I think it's Handbook for Driven Design. I've got a link at the end of the presentation, but it's a really good read. I'd recommend having a look if you're interested in learning more about data visualization. But we'll go through each of those 3 principles. So starting off with good data visualization should be trustworthy. And this goes back to the start where we're talking about building trust with our business stakeholders so that they can take action from our insights. This is where this feeds into. And first of all, we try to avoid sensationalist colors and fonts. And the reason for that being is we inherently associate that with tabloid media, with adverts, things that are being pushed at us. They're trying to get our attention. And for that reason, we're inherently less trustful of things that are trying to grab our attention and being pushed upon us. So we always try and avoid sensationalist colors and fonts. Another really important one is that we don't make assumptions beyond our own knowledge. So when we're building insights, as I said before, a lot of the time with quantitative data, we know a lot about what's happening, but we often don't have the other side, which is maybe more the qualitative research, which tells us why these things are happening. So it's very easy to build a narrative behind the insights you're seeing and build up a story as to why that's happening, but that needs to be grounded in truth. So only do that if you actually know it to be the case. And I've used the kind of classic example from correlation doesn't mean causation, that ice cream sales cause shark attacks. It's actually temperature which is causing both of those. So that's a really important one. And I think one thing I'd also add in that is that we're here to kind of support business stakeholders to make their decision. We're not here to make the decision itself. And because of that, we don't have all the subject matter knowledge that they do. So we're not expected to be experts in that side of things. That's why we work with the business side to understand that. The third point is it's important to not hide any anomalies in the data. And if you can, I'd explicitly call them out as well. And quite often you'll find you'll come across data quality issues working with the data set, and there's some strange values. Maybe there's a lot of null values in a specific field you're looking at. I would say it's always important to pull that out front and center. Don't hide it away. The two reasons for that is we always want to show the full picture of the data. Just because something doesn't fit how we'd like it to show, it doesn't mean we should hide it away. But also it helps to get those things looked at. If we do have a lot of data quality issues, highlighting them in our data visualization makes someone more, it gives them more appeal to go and actually go out and fix that as well. And lastly, as we talked about before, we should always strive for neutrality and minimize bias. So we need to decide what we include based on what we think is useful. And we do that. It's a lot of kind of critical thinking coming in there, and we kind of work with business stakeholders to determine what we think will be useful to them or what won't be. But we always try and be neutral. So good data visualization should be accessible. I think the most important thing about accessibility is thinking about time and your audience. So how much time does your audience have to look at what you're showing them? And that's going to dictate how you design the visualization. So if you're designing it for someone who's maybe interested in kind of researching the insights in depth and spending a lot of time, maybe they're a researcher within your organization, you want to give them a lot more interactivity. You want to let them play about with things, maybe some more complex visuals so they can get to some more complex insights. That might work really well. But if you've got a very senior audience and maybe they only have 1 or 2 minutes to consume what you're showing them, then you don't want it to be complicated. You want it to be simple and you want to get straight to the point. So considering your audience is really, really important, and the amount of time they have to look at what you're showing them will dictate how you design it. It can be all too tempting to put in a fancy visualization, maybe something like a sunburst or a Sankey diagram, and visually they might look very, very impressive, but it can also, some who are less kind of used to looking at those complex data visualizations can also put up barriers in that they don't want to spend the time to learn what you're showing them or to think about understanding it. They just, if they only have a couple minutes to look at it, for example, they just want to get the takeaway, and that's where maybe a bar chart or a line chart would work better. In terms of accessibility, color choice is a really important one. So you're always trying to design considering those who are colorblind. And on that note, I've put a diagram in the right which shows you different spectrums between the different forms of kind of color blindness. And you see normal vision in the top left, and then you see the other forms. And what you see is that the blues and orange of normal vision have really good contrast across all the different forms there. So typically we try to work within blues and oranges. That can be difficult to do sometimes if maybe organizations want you to stick to their own corporate colors, but where possible, definitely try and design with kind of colorblind people in mind. And lastly, building in interactivity. It's a really powerful tool, and it lets for those for the audiences that want to explore a bit more in depth what you're showing them, giving them a bit of extra interactivity, lets them do some kind of get to some insights themselves and explore the data and see what they're seeing in it too. So the third principle here, good data visualization should be elegant. It kind of comes on from the previous two. If we've those, it should be trustworthy, it should be accessible. That's absolutely imperative. But if it can be both of those, then it should also be elegant too. And what we're saying there is good data visualization, it should be useful, but it should be beautiful as well. So this comes down to how we design it. And what I always aim to do with data visualizations is keep them as clean as possible. So everything on the screen must be justified. It must have a reason to be there. And where possible, I'm always trying to take away things on screen. So if you can maybe incorporate your legend into the title by coloring the text in the title, that's quite a neat way to clean up some space on screen. You can also do hover over kind of tips that pop up They give you more information, and it means you can take less on screen and make it more interactive instead. And we'll work through an example of that in the kind of live demo that we're going to come on to in a minute. And you should also consider the focal point. So when we're building a visualization, what do we want the audience to look at? What's the kind of takeaway that we want their eyes to be pointed at? Naturally, people look at screens from the top left down. So we should have, usually I design with kind of a main visualization taking up the majority of the screen. And that's the focus for the screen we're looking at. So it helps us to guide our audience on their thought process, because we're in control of where their eyes look first to an extent, and where we focus our attention. So we should be pointing them towards the things that we think are going to be most important for them first. And talking about the thought process, I'm now going to talk a bit more about this visualization thought process. And this one I find really interesting because we're not actually in control of as much as you think we are. And that's because we can build a visualization and we can get our own conclusions on it, we can get our own insights. But again, because most of the time we don't have that subject matter knowledge or expertise, we might take away a different opinion to somebody who knows the subject in depth. They might take away a very different kind of story from what we're showing them. And to kind of demonstrate this, I've got an example here from Glasgow. So this is a visualization I put together, which is showing deprivation levels across Glasgow. And the red areas are the more deprived areas, and the blue areas are the less deprived areas. And the interesting thing here is, I'm sure many of you probably know Glasgow quite well. So you'll see the West End, as expected, relatively blue. The East End, deeper red, for example. Areas of the South Side, maybe more traditionally industrial, are also more deprived as well. If we look at, it's a small area on screen, but around about Dennistoun, that's where I'm based. So I know that area quite well. But interestingly here, to give you a sense of how your own knowledge of a subject can change the messages you're taking away from this. I know this blue area right here is very well off, and that's because of historically Dennistoun was designed to be quite an affluent area, and they started off by building that little blue zone of detached houses, and then all the rest came after, and the areas to the south came at a later date when they kind of moved away from that vision. But it's interesting. I always find it interesting because the messages that your audience takes away from your visualization is going to be dictated by their own knowledge and experience of the subject that they're looking at in the visualization. And cognitive biases can also play a big role as well. So it's probably a completely separate presentation on its own, but it's an interesting one there. People maybe already have an opinion they want to confirm. They'll look for things that support their opinion in the visualization, for example. So that's another thing to be aware of, and how cognitive biases can come into how people interpret data visualizations as well. So before we move on to a live example, this kind of feeds us into it. So we've got our data visualization together and uses all the principles of good design. It looks fantastic. How do we go about actually engaging our stakeholders so that they're interested in taking action from it and understanding what we're showing them? So I think firstly, the most important thing is to be driven to understand true meaning of the data. And what I mean by that is getting to the root cause of what you're seeing within the quantitative data. So it's really important to tie up your quantitative insights with qualitative research if you want to build that narrative to say what's happening, why what you're seeing is happening. And to give you an example of that, so a role I worked in previously, I was looking at kind of interactions within our mobile app, and there was a feature in there that wasn't very well liked within the business side, within business stakeholders. And it came out within the analysis that this page was getting very few views within the app. It wasn't being interacted with much by the customers. And immediately the kind of conclusion we got to there was, well, it's not useful. We've wanted rid of this for a while. And here's the evidence we need to do that. But actually, after speaking to the research teams, it came out that within the customer research, that customers found the user interface really difficult. So they're finding it really hard to navigate to this feature. So the reason it was getting no page views is because nobody could find it, not because they didn't want it. And that was a really key example there, how important it is to tie up your qualitative with your quantitative, and how it's really important, why it's really important not to jump to any conclusions as well. Second of all, knowing your audience is really important so that you can kind of resonate with them and speak in their language. So for example, your audience, they're probably not interested in, I don't know how many % something went up. They're probably interested in how many complaints is this going to reduce into the bank, for example, or it's about talking in terms that are important to them. And that's what kind of grabs their attention. And lastly, this is probably the most important technique. I've kind of been using this for a little while, but it's really important to take your audience on the journey. So just instead of showing them the end result and the end insight you're trying to get across, start a few levels before and set the scene with some context before you get to that kind of final insight that you're trying to show to them. And the reason for doing that is by taking them through effectively your thought process, they can understand how you got to the conclusion you did and the insight you're showing them. And that helps to build trust. It helps to build their understanding of the insights that you're showing them. But also what's really great, and you'll know you succeeded if you get this, but if you take them through, maybe you've got 4 kind of screens of visualizations that are slowly getting deeper into what you're showing. If by the time you get to kind of the last screen, which is the real insight you're trying to show them, if they spot it themselves before you tell them it, then that's really, really powerful, because then your business stakeholders, they have a kind of sense that they've come up with this themselves, so they've seen it for themselves, and it makes it a lot more memorable, and they're much more likely to take action from it too, because they can relate that to being something that they've spotted in the data. So that's a really powerful technique, and I've found it to work quite effectively in the past. So that's the end of the first part of the presentation. We're now going to jump into a live example, which we're going to talk through to kind of put this into practice and show you how it works. So this live example, hopefully quite an interesting one. So this is based off some analysis I've been doing over the past month or so in my spare time. And I've pulled down 35 million tweets from Twitter, which is every tweet in the English language mentioning the word vaccine since January 2020. And I've then looked for specific mentions of the different vaccines, so AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Sputnik, and so on and so forth. I've picked out, I think there's 7 kind of core vaccines which I've focused in on. Obviously, there's a multitude of vaccines out there, so I've limited it to the 7 that I guess we're probably most aware of within the UK. I've then also looked for mentions of country names within the tweet. It's not perfect, but it helps us to try and relate that back to what country that tweet was directed at, because we don't have access to the location in the data set I've built. And then lastly, we score sentiment. So we're trying to, for each of those 35 million tweets, we're trying to work out how positive or negative they are. And I'm running it through, it's the Vader sentiment model is what I'm using. But what that effectively does is it looks at the types of words used, and words get assigned a score based on how positive or negative they are. It also takes into account punctuation. So say you write lots of exclamation marks at the end of your tweet, that indicates much stronger feeling. And the other thing as well is, really importantly with social media, it takes into account emojis. And for determining something's positive or negative, emojis are one of the most powerful things we can have because they explicitly tell you how someone's feeling, which sometimes you find sentiment, whether it's positive or negative, it can be implied, but it's not explicitly there in the words. But an emoji tells you that straight away. So it's quite a nice model if you're interested. It's, yeah, Vader is the model I use there if you're interested in looking at it further. So this is the story we're going to look at. One thing I'd maybe call out here as well is when I'm showing off analysis to business stakeholders, I quite often put the big numbers in there. So we've got 35 million tweets there. That's one thing that's also quite a good thing to do. It's because I find I tend to get quite accustomed to working with large data sets, and it's quite normal for us. But you forget that for maybe a business audience, this is really quite unbelievable. Maybe you're doing 2 or 3 billion transactions you're looking at. That's something that's quite fascinating. So I always try and put those numbers in there with the caveat that you're not trying to scare people with the complexity. That's important. You're always trying to portray it in a way that's kind of easy to understand. Not simplistic, probably the wrong word, but relatable and understandable. We're not trying to kind of cloud it with complexity. So the story we're going to look at, I've built it up in Tableau. So this is the presentation, the story we'll be running through in Tableau here. So Tableau is a data visualization tool, which I've been using for the past 4 years now. And they've got a free version available as well, which I'll talk about after we've ran through these screens here and how you can start to work with it if you're interested in doing so. So as I say, 35 million tweets fed into this. And what I've done is I've looked at the mean sentiment by week for all tweets that mention vaccine within the English language. And we've taken the average sentiment. So sentiment is measured from -100 through to 100. You can see in the right there, you've got that legend. So and positive is anything over 5, neutral is -5 to 5, and negative is anything less than 5. What we're showing here is with the kind of area chart in orange, we're looking at the number of tweets that mention vaccine to show the kind of popularity of how it's been talked about in social media by week. And with the blue line, we're tracking the kind of average sentiment over time. And what you can see here is early on, kind of around January time, most of the tweets then were mostly around kind of anti-vaxxers and campaigns going against vaccines. This was before COVID really kicked off. So I guess what we're kind of mostly interested in, the period for November gets very interesting because that's when the first kind of trials results started coming through. So we see some interest around about kind of March, April time as kind of lockdowns are starting to take force across the world. Things drop off kind of through summer, stay relatively stable. There's kind of no major breakthroughs on the vaccines at that point, and throughout the kind of Western world, within Europe certainly, where a lot of the English language tweets come from, things were quite quiet over summer, and obviously things started to open up a lot last summer. Around about November time, that's when Pfizer released their 90% efficacy results, and you can see that spike called out in the chart there. So there's a lot more interest from that point on in vaccines, a lot more discussion going on Twitter about them as well. You can see the sentiment peaked the highest it's ever been that week. Obviously, it was very, very positive news. Shortly after AstraZeneca released their results, and you see another spike just after Pfizer. After then, things have stayed relatively stable, stable-ish, a wee bit up and down, but things have stayed relatively stable since round about kind of upper threshold and neutral, touching into positive at times. But what was interesting is throughout these periods here, what I noticed is there'll be a lot of regional differences in there, depending on how vaccine rollouts are going within individual countries too, which we don't see within this chart, but it's something we're about to drop into in more detail now. So if I go in to the next tab, we're going to go in kind of the next level down. So we've seen how things are at the high level and the high level trend over time. We're now going to go and look at this by country mentioned. There are a couple caveats I'd like to say with this. Obviously, this is only English language tweets, so there's a lot more tweets within English speaking countries. So that's the first thing to note. And also, this is Twitter only, so some countries, such as China, most prominently, will use Twitter much less than other countries. So that's one thing to be aware of, but it's still useful for kind of high-level trends and insights. It's obviously very, very interesting. It's the full data set of English language Twitter tweets about vaccines. So this is our map, and what we're looking at here is we're looking at the mean sentiment by the country that was mentioned. I've excluded any countries with fewer than 250 tweets, as we don't have enough to generate a kind of meaningful score there. I've got a summary of the the sentiment by continent as well down the right. And one thing I found quite interesting there is when we look at Oceania, what we see there is that it's actually one of the most positive of all the continents at 6.4 sentiment, which is quite interesting because their vaccine rollouts haven't been going overly well within Australia. But then we do know within New Zealand, they've obviously managed their COVID situation very well through lockdowns and almost eliminated it. When you hover over, you also see that you get a pop-up tooltip and it shows you that trend over time as well. So this touches into something that we talked about earlier, about trying to minimize what we put on screen. And by kind of having these interactive pop-up tooltips, it lets you give a lot more information without kind of blowing up the screen and with too much complexity. But it is quite interesting that you see in Australia, they have historically been quite positive about vaccines, but around about March, April, things got a bit more negative, and obviously the rollout hasn't gone as well there. So that might be the reason we're seeing that in there. I'm going to look in specifically at Europe as well, because that's probably the most relatable to our area. This is an interesting one, and the thing that surprised me here was that Norway was one of the most negative in the world on Twitter about vaccines, which I found to be quite interesting. And if we hover over to see their trend, you can see they initially were quite positive. Then from January onwards, they have been really quite negative towards vaccines. The UK is fairly positive on the whole. Obviously, our rollout is going quite well. Throughout Europe, you see pockets. Some countries are more positive than others, but definitely there will be an impact of the EU vaccine rollout here. It hasn't gone wonderfully, and there will be kind of trends we're seeing there. So we've hovered over a few countries there, and we've seen their trend over time. What we're going to go and do now is step through a kind of animation, or an animation of sorts, of how that looks by month, which is going to kind of bring it to life a lot more. So here we're going to start to step through each month. So we start in November 2020, and again, countries with fewer than 250 tweets within a given month, they've been excluded. So we see them kind of grayed out because we don't have enough in there. So November 2020 is when the first Pfizer released their first results before any rollout started happening. You can see broadly across the world, relatively positive with a few exceptions in there. Very positive within Europe, certainly. And then if we go into looking at December, again, things are relatively positive throughout Europe, certainly, throughout the world. Again, the kind of rollout started kind of late December, I think, within the UK. So we'll start to see this take effect within January. So when we flick on to January here, this is interesting because you see now that within the EU, the bulk of the kind of EU countries in here are kind of going neutral or negative, and Norway has gone exceptionally negative. And I think one of the drivers behind that will be UK's vaccine rollout is going ahead very well at this point. Obviously, the EU's vaccine rollout had stalled quite significantly within January. So I think that's part of the reason we're seeing that kind of more neutral, borderline negative sentiment within the EU there. When we go ahead to February, things get a bit more positive within the EU. Looking across the rest of the world, North America is going to stay relatively neutral throughout the months, which is quite interesting. It's relatively stable. So February, things are neutral to positive. Norway is still very negative. And I think one of the reasons we see Norway being quite negative as well is that the government's taking quite a hardline approach to blocking any vaccines that may have side effects. So AstraZeneca, for example, is banned within Norway, despite being allowed within the rest of the EU. I suspect that's probably having an influence on the sentiment we're seeing there within the tweets. We go through to March, and this is where things really started coming out about the side effects that I was talking about just there. And yeah, the EU, I think, put a temporary block on AstraZeneca, and we see that combined with the slow progress of the rollout. We see with kind of mainland Europe, things are quite negative within March. We see Australia go quite negative as well. Again, North America, positive/neutral. It's still staying relatively stable throughout the timeline we're looking at here. And lastly, when we go to April, things kind of settle down, and mostly across the world, fairly neutral. Australia again, negative, but we know their rollout isn't going quite as well. So I focus mainly on kind of Europe, North America, Australia there. That's mainly because they're all English-speaking countries. There are insights you can pull out to other countries as well. Like if you look at China, we do have 41,000 tweets, for example, for China. So it's not a small sample size, but obviously it's not as representative of the countries. Because Twitter is more widely used, as I say, within the likes of Europe. So taking it down a level, we're now going to break it down. So looking at the individual vaccines that I mentioned, how does that vary by continent? And to do this, I've looked for mentions of each of the vaccines that we see on the left, and then I've looked for mentions of countries, and then related that back to the continents that they sit in. Interestingly, across the board, almost apart from in South America, AstraZeneca has fairly kind of neutral to negative sentiment. Asia is slightly more positive as well, but within Europe, certainly it's notably far lower sentiment than the other vaccines. Johnson & Johnson also scoring quite lowly across the board. What was interesting was that the Chinese vaccines as Sinopharm and Sinovac across all continents actually got fairly favorable sentiment on Twitter. Sputnik as well, the Russian vaccine, fairly positive, except from South America, which we see it quite negative. And Moderna as well, like really kind of unanimously. Pfizer has a few variations. Pfizer seems to be very popular within Oceania, so mainly Australia, New Zealand. I think Philippines are captured within that as well. So Pfizer is very positive there. And moving on from this, so this got me thinking when I was looking at the individual vaccines and relating that back to sentiment by continent, it started to get me thinking is, would vaccines designed within a given country, say we're looking at Russia, would the Sputnik vaccine be more popular or have more favorable sentiment within Russia compared to other vaccines? So this last visualization, I appreciate, is quite a lot going on, and a bit much for my liking, if I'm honest. But I wanted to look at, so in the orange are the vaccines that were designed within the given country. So for the first row, we see there within Russia, you see the orange vaccine being Sputnik. So for each country, the orange bar represents the vaccine that was designed within that country. And interestingly, what we saw within Russia, although Sputnik is fairly positive, the Chinese vaccines, Sinopharm, Sinovac, were actually much more favorable than Sputnik in social media, which is quite interesting. It makes sense. China is quite a close ally of Russia, so not unexpected, but interesting it was so far ahead of Sputnik. Within the UK, AstraZeneca fairly low down the order compared to the other vaccines, only ahead of Johnson & Johnson. Within China, interestingly, you see Sputnik there. It was the most favorable vaccine within China, which is quite interesting. Sinopharm, Sinovac were also very positive, though, nearing the top. There may, again, we do have a smaller sample with China, but there may also be an element, perhaps speech is a bit more controlled within China. That might have an impact on what we're seeing there as well. Within the USA, it's fairly evenly mixed. There's no kind of clear, the home vaccines aren't being kind of clearly favored towards the top within the US. And within Germany, what I found really notable here is how negative Germany was about AstraZeneca. Like -7 is, very negative compared to what we see within other countries there. But in general, speaking across the board, there wasn't a kind of clear relationship across all the countries anyway, that showed that home vaccines were viewed more favorably, more positively on Twitter compared to other vaccines in use or other vaccines within that country. So that comes to an end of the visualizations that I was going to show. But before I kind of wrap up, the last thing I wanted to touch on was showing this, it's all great, but how could you get started in it if you're interested in doing something similar? So I've got some resources here on how you can get started. And first of all, I think if the most important thing is to have an interest in the data you're looking at, you're analysing. So I'm sure many of you will be aware of Kaggle already. It's a great resource for publicly available data. There's others such as the ONS is a really good one. Scottish Government have a website too, which has a lot of interesting data sources on it. So pick up a data set you're interested in. If you're a registered student, then you can get Tableau for free. So I've put the link to Tableau for students, and they offer the fully featured Tableau Professional kind of desktop software. Free of charge, so you get it in, I think it's a year's license at a time, but it's quite easy to pick up and run with. There's also a lot of online learning resources on the Tableau website. If you're not a student, you can also get Tableau Public for free, which is almost fully featured. The only difference is you can't do database connections, but if you're using it on your own laptop, it's unlikely you're going to have a database to connect to anyway. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, that book by Andy Kirk, Visualizing Data, is a really, really good one. Kind of generic best practice around data visualization. Doesn't matter what tool you're using, if it's Tableau, maybe it's Power BI or ClickView, one of the visualization tools, the principles work across them all. So I'd highly recommend having a read through there if you're interested. But yeah, that sums up everything for me. So thanks a lot for listening, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Gavin. That's just absolutely lovely. I mean, that's my takeaway. Good visualization should be useful and beautiful. Mm-hmm. I mean, just those words, I think, are just it's just so inspiring when you, having come through what the students went through yesterday about design and the importance of getting your message over. That simplicity and elegance should always be at the back of your mind, and I really love that. So any questions? I see there's let me see what's in the chat. Banji's just asking that you're going to share the presentation file. That's right, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay,
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Brilliant.
There's also a link as well, so if you're interested in exploring as well, you can follow this link here, and that will take you to the Tableau website where it's published, so you can interact with the visualizations on there as well if you're interested in doing so.
That's fantastic. So
can I just jump in with a question, Marion?
Please do. Please do.
So thank you. I think that was really interesting. I'm curious. You know, there's a lot of disinformation and bots and things. Did you look at that? I was a bit surprised at the high Chinese and Russian sentiment, and the skeptic in me thought, I wonder if there's some kind of automated accounts in there. Did you look at that?
Not something I've looked at yet, but yeah, I think you're spot on. There will be elements of that in play within some countries. And one thing I was interested in looking at, I was looking for kind of similar text and tweets that were being mentioned maybe multiple times. And it's difficult to take out though what's I guess what's reshared from a genuine source versus what's kind of, I guess, government pushed disinformation, if you like. So there's a lot more you can do with this, and that's one of them. It'd be interesting to look at I guess kind of fake news disinformation side. Another thing would be really interested in looking at is, can you relate this back to vaccination uptake rates as well within different countries? So is there a relationship between the sentiment we see in Twitter and what we see in terms of vaccination uptakes in real life? Whether Twitter is the cause of that is another question altogether. It'd be interesting to look at. And then also, I think taking it to another level, looking for kind of the themes within the text as well would be interesting. But to do that, I was kind of pushing the limits of my own laptop to do this. I would definitely need to use the cloud if I was doing kind of topic modeling or something more advanced.
Cool, thank you.
So Christian, I don't know whether you're there, Christian, if you'd like to give your comment in person, switch your camera on and say hello. Christian's just talking about, he's asking how representative sentiment shared in Twitter in comparison to the general population. He's just saying with Twitter users being from a younger demographic and possibly better educated.
Yeah.
Access to technology. And he's
Yeah,
just saying, are there ways to make this comparison?
yeah, I think doing it on, obviously this is a bit of a side project I've been playing with in my spare time, but if you taking it to the next level, obviously, yeah, it would be really interesting related back to if you can get demographics data by country on Twitter usage. It'd be interesting to start to use that to better inform how that compares across different countries. So this is the kind of initial kind of phase of it. You could take this a lot further, but I think I may need to, put my day job on hold to do the full extent of it, which obviously I can't do. But yeah, definitely be interesting to throw in demographics data. And it's one important caveat I was quite conscious of, in that firstly, Twitter is only a kind of subset of social media, especially in some countries it's not as widely used. I haven't pulled the data on how widely used Twitter is within each country, or the kind of demographics within each country, but it's definitely a great idea for a kind of future edition.
So Artie's asking how to judge between chart junk and eye-catching presentations. How can we decide?
Yeah, so the thing is, it's easy to make something. I guess it's always easy to make something that is eye-catching, and it's up. I guess it's up to you as sitting in the role of the data visualizer. It's your role to decide what you think is going to be useful and what isn't, in conjunction with working with business people. But we should be aiming to put out things that are, as I say, eye-catching and useful. But I guess that sits, if you're designing the visualization, that kind of remit sits with you. And one of the important things there is data visualization helps to build trust. But it can also, I guess, if you're looking to create a misrepresentative view of, or something that isn't actually that useful, if you make it really eye-catching, really beautiful, you may trick like a business stakeholder into thinking it is great, and they should be spending some time looking at what it's telling them. So I guess that's the other important part of data visualization. Yes, it builds trust, but you shouldn't abuse the trust by building something that looks beautifully or very beautiful, but isn't actually very useful at all. I guess that role sits with the data visualizer, and yeah, you need to be careful what you're putting out there, and always do it with kind of best interests of the audience you're building it for.
I think Rona's got a good point. Do Norwegians typically tweet in English?
Yeah, that again, that comes down to kind of caveats with the English language. So it's only a subset within Europe, and it's a good point. I haven't done the analysis of pulling the different language tweets. I think it'd be really nice to pull from the different languages and then run it through a translation model to maybe put it all back into English, for example, so you can then run it through, because the Vader model I used as well, that's only for the English language too, which is important to know. So that doesn't work with other languages. So the way you would need to do it would be to translate from other languages into English and run it through the model. But yeah, an excellent point. And again, don't have the answer straight off the bat here. It's a kind of future builder. There's lots of scope for taking this further. It's a really valuable data set, really interesting. There's so much you can do with it, and this has only really scratched the surface.
Jasmine is just saying, how is the general country sentiment related to the vaccine sentiment? So how much is the sentiment really related to the vaccine? And I think that's building on Alan's points earlier. She says, I think what made me suspicious is the jump in Myanmar, March, April 2021. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and I guess when I was thinking about what the causes behind this were, I was firstly really conscious that I don't have the knowledge in this to speak kind of about the in-depth causes of what's going on. I don't know enough about that to do all that, but in terms of the causes, it's true. It might be, there's probably other factors influencing, I guess, general sentiment in countries, which probably feeds into other topic areas too. So again, good point. And there's probably wider sentiment within the country at play influencing things too. That is the problem with something, looking at kind of social media and topics widely discussed at this. there's so many other influencers and factors that could be influencing what we're looking at. So I guess it's important to show what we're seeing, but with the caveats that this is the limitations of what we're seeing here. And yeah, there's a lot more that to do with it too.
Sorry, I was just muting because the bin man's just going by in my street. Gavin's just asking if you could share the link to the visualization. But
yeah, no problem. So that I'll go out with so on the pack here, just follow this link here to follow the story. I'm going to update it with May's data as well. Obviously, it's just turned 1st June, so I thought it'd be a bit risky to run that refresh before this presentation. So that will be going in over the next few days. But yeah, follow the link in the presentation and you can get to it just through there.
One of the things you mentioned there, Gav, was during your presentation there was that you can use statistics and visualization to lead a narrative. You can take the parts of the data that you like. Say, have you ever in your sort of work environment been asked to show a story that you don't see in the data to emphasize that, say, a department's doing better than it is, or something along those lines where it starts to question your own ethics about displaying that data?
Yeah, I have had it before. I've been fortunate that whenever that's happened, it's not been from within my own team. It's been from a customer asking for it. So it makes it easier to say, well, no, we stand by our principles. We're not going to do that. So I have had it asked for before. Specifically, we had maybe not as major one, but we had I can't remember what we were measuring, but we had we're looking at numbers with rounded to 2 decimal places, and it showed one category as being slightly above the other, which they wanted them to be the other way around. So like, can we just round that one up and round that one down? So, no way, not happening. So I have had it happen before. For the most part, it's very, very rare, I would say. And yeah, it's always been from customers, never from within my own team, which means my bosses have always stood by me and you're able to say, no, we're standing by our principles here. We're not doing that. But yeah, it can be challenging.
Here's a question from Ben. He's just saying, how do you explain to stakeholders, decision makers with no data science background that we usually cannot draw strong and simple conclusions? E.g., it might be crude to say Norway has a negative outlook on vaccines and make decisions on that basis. I think most of us want to make things more simple than they are. That's a really good point, isn't it? Everything's complex.
Yeah, it's always a challenge you have, especially showing off the outputs of machine learning models to business stakeholders, because we want it to appear simple. We don't want it to be daunting, and we're definitely not trying to portray it as being, even though there's a lot to it and it's quite complex behind the scenes, we want the stakeholder to have quite a simple kind of overall view of what's happening that they can understand and relate to. So yeah, it's a difficult one, but it's just a balance. So I guess only showing as much information as you need to, and don't be afraid to call out the limitations too. There's only so much we can do. So I would never be afraid to call out the shortcomings of what we have or where it kind of stops being useful. And that's also really important, because when they're making that decision of how they take action from the insight, they can then make the decision with that in mind as to what are the limitations of what we're looking at. But I always try and keep it out of the technical. So when we're showing, talk about the limitations of what we're showing, always take it out of the technical and give an actual example of where it falls down. So for example, where we're talking about English language only, we could do some sort of statistical analysis of how representative it is across different languages. And if we simplify enough, yes, it will be insightful. But by taking it through maybe a real world example where maybe we pick out a country that isn't English language speaking and we can see the drop off in the number of tweets versus others, for example, something that makes it more relatable and more meaningful is usually the way I'd approach it.
I think also here we're presuming that when people are tweeting, they're talking, say, politically or how they think the vaccine's going constantly. Now, from what I've seen online so far, or social media, it's quite often been very personal. People that are very positive about the vaccine are saying, I got the vaccine, felt terrible for one day. So you know, it's a very personal thing. They're actually very positive about it, but they're relating their personal experience of getting small side effect. And you'd expect that in a country that's got a very good rollout. More people are getting it. More people are going to say they felt bad for a day. So you're kind of possibly the initial assumptions got some issues as well. But again, these things are how it's important.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to model the intent behind the text as well. So if you combine the sentiment analysis with modeling the intent of what the tweet's doing, perhaps maybe taking a topic model approach as well, we can start to split out what are the tweets about the kind of vaccine side effects, what are the tweets about, I guess, maybe opinions towards governments, for example, or opinions towards rollouts. It'd be then interesting to track the different topics by the different countries. And then you start to break it down a bit further into that kind of next layer down. Because there will be, obviously, there's going to be a mix of things within there. We're looking at it at a very, very high level as a catch-all. But yeah, that I think the topic modeling would be really fascinating to do. Yeah, my laptop was struggling as we are, but yeah, you're spot on there. I think as well, often with these things, it's combining multiple approaches together is what generates kind of full picture of what we're looking at. So sentiment analysis alone doesn't give everything. We'd want to combine it with other approaches too.
Yeah, even sentiment analysis within cultures is slightly different. The expression "no bad" is quite often excellent in Glasgow. May use more superlatives to explain how they feel about things. I know that was it down south they say quite often that'll do, which is again means excellent, but within a sentiment analysis you can't do that across cultures. And even how say people in different countries like Norway, if it isn't part of the EU, so that wouldn't be part of that rollout, but they may use it differently as a second language, I suppose.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because the radar model, obviously the sentiment models, to do it well, this is a kind of unsupervised approach. We're applying rules, so we're taking a word and saying how positive and negative it is, and we're applying a score to it. It would be nice, obviously, to do it with tweets that we already know how positive or negative they are, and build up a model from that. It's probably going to have far higher levels of accuracy, but obviously we spend a couple months of our lives labeling tweets, which is the downside of that approach. So yeah, the Veda model is more simplistic with the other sentiment models out there, but it has the advantage, obviously, we don't need to have kind of training data to get it running.
Sorry, I just muted myself there. We've got another question from Cameron about open source data visualization tools that you might recommend, Gavin. Cameron's just about, he's on his placement, so he says he's not sure if Tableau is financially viable for the business that he's working in. Yeah,
so I'll be honest, everywhere I've worked, I've always had access to Tableau, so I've never really had a need to use open source visualization tools. I know within Python you also have Seaborn, and I think there's another. I think Plotly is coming up quite nicely within Python too. But I'll be honest, I don't have as wide a knowledge of the open source visualization tools because I've always had Tableau available to me, so that's always been my go-to. So I'm probably not best placed to give you a good opinion on that one.
Oh, there's Artie saying BI and Plotly is open source. So there's your answer. And Power BI, which is what we use at the Data Lab. So any more questions from anyone? I'd just like, because we're now 7 minutes past 10, and I know everybody's got busy days today, I'd really love to give Gavin a huge virtual round of applause, because that was really a lovely and very inspiring presentation with so much detail and data and technique in it. Thank you so much. We all really appreciate that. That was lovely, and it's just a beautiful jumping pad for the rest of today. So if students are not involved in the data challenge, they're either doing GIS, we've got a workshop on GIS, or a session on Git and GitHub. So, you know, these are, I just hope you've all got taken away loads from that. And thank you so much, Gavin. Thank you very much for giving us your time. We really, really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thanks everyone for joining and listening in. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I've popped the InkPath app up, so if you can do your things, everyone, and then just let us know if it works or not, because hopefully it does. Are you seeing it? Fraser looks puzzled. Can you see it? Can you see it, Gavin?
Everything worked for me. Thank you.
Okay,
Yes,
perfect. Thank you, Max. That's
Thank
what we
you.
want to know. Thank you so much. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Gavin.